Hi, I am Kate Winslet, and I'm here today to spend a delicious 30 minutes with the brilliant screenwriter and director of the movie Belfast, and my old and very dear, much loved friend, Ken Branagh. Hi, Ken.
Hi, Kate. Thank you so much for doing this. You are very, very kind.
Well, it's an absolute pleasure, and I'm very excited to talk about this film. I want to talk about a few things with you that I want to cover. First, I want to talk about the rehearsal process and working with young actors, and then I want to talk about the soundscape for the film, which I found utterly compelling and equally as emotional, actually, as the performances. So let me start then with just asking you. When you sat down, as I know you did during lockdown, to write this story about a part of your childhood, did you know how hard it was going to be to build in those brilliant moments of brevity? Because the lightness that you found, that, I mean, it's black and white, but that rush of joyful color that you give us with Shitty Shitty Bang Bang when they go to the pictures together, those moments were so few and far between, but so perfectly placed and so welcomed. And I just wondered how much of that brevity you found as you were writing, and also then in the rehearsal process, because I'm sure a lot came out of that working with your actors. Can you just talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, thank you very, very much for that. I really appreciate your appreciation of that. Finding the tone took a long time, actually, because, as you say, I guess the goal or the instinct was it should be as brief as possible. There's a funny quote in the play Love's Labour's Lost. The character of Barone is at the end of the play. He's forced to make people in hospital laugh. And he says, he questions this, and he says, "To move wild laughter in the throat of death, it cannot be. It is impossible." And when I sat down to write a story about Belfast in 1969, at the beginning of the Troubles, I thought, well, how can I really find this kind of economy that will allow people to laugh? And then, you know, the story itself starts to talk back to you, because, of course, that was the coping mechanism. Trips to the pictures of the coping mechanism, singing, dancing, ad hoc family parties, any chance that you could fling yourself at joy was really what began to kind of form the shape. That was the breath in between this sort of undercurrent of tension that does this revolution in the first 5 minutes of the film of happy place becomes, you know, very, very scary place. And so as that applied to how we could sort of try and practically do it, one of the things, I wonder how you feel about this. When the actors sat down, there was perhaps a natural inclination to sort of quiz me about how much of this was exactly true. Or, for instance, Jamie Dornan, who plays Pa in the movie, which is inspired by, but not a literal version of my own father, was very keen to start asking quite a lot of specific questions about betting. My dad liked to have a bet on the horses. And I said, well, I can start to tell you, you know, quite a bit about this, or could we start talking about your dad? And can we maybe see whether the beginning of this process, to get back to your question about sort of economy or brevity, I think it's sometimes achieved when the actors themselves have such a sort of complete sort of understanding and ownership of what they're doing. And one of the things I felt I didn't want them to have to do was feel that they were in a slavish demand to recreate total specifics of my family's life, but instead to see what they could bring of their own. And once they started doing that, that's when, in rehearsal, that's when I felt as though it was becoming something else. It was becoming theirs. And because they knew it so well, they could do less, and things took less time, and words began to be cut, and things that were spoken became things that were reacted to. So it was an instinct about style that started with a conversation and rehearsal with the actors to see whether we together could find a way to sort of start achieving it.
Yeah, and I'm sure, I mean, I'm so fascinated by that, and I'm almost jealous that I wasn't in that rehearsal room, because I know that you all had a delicious time, and I can just feel that you did. And I also know, knowing you as I do as a director, that one of the things you are absolutely brilliant at is pulling people together as a family. And I loved seeing some of the usual suspects in there with Johnny Sessions. And I also noticed a couple of Branaghs in the credits at the end, which I loved. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about that sense of family, I guess, because for me, the film is family. It's all about family, and how at the end of the day, that is the most precious thing of all. And I felt that really profoundly. I found it deeply, deeply moving because of that sense of family, especially now in these COVID times when families have been separated for such long periods of time and our friendships have become like this on Zoom. I mean, you and I haven't seen each other for more than 2 years. And it's different. So that sense of, I guess, community, the rhythms and the rituals of community, in particular, that type of working class background that I know you come from, and I also come from too, where, you know, when the woman down the road's had a varicose veins done, the whole street knows about it. So, but you, Ken, you did that so beautifully. So I wanted to, just to your point about encouraging the actors to bring in elements of their own lives and their own parenting backgrounds, how much did you find yourself allowing them, I suppose, to really find their own rhythm based on their own childhoods and the things that they had brought to the table? Actually, and particularly lovely Jude Hill, who plays Buddy. My God, what a great kid. But I just want to talk a little bit more about that really juicy time that you all spent in the rehearsal room and how long you had.
Well, because of, you explain it all very well, and I think you're right. You're absolutely right about in a way, something that we've been the lucky beneficiaries of as the film's gone out into the world, is that this sense, whether it's just simply being in a big communal experience of watching a film again in a big dark room, big image, and real people alongside us, with the experience being different from in our own front rooms where you can turn it off and you put the kettle on or do whatever. If you're in that different kind of more formal, ritualistic version of things, with this particular film and what it talks about, that's been a very emotional experience. Been a lot of emotional screenings of this film, particularly early on. For me, it was critical to try and get other people's sort of examples of what it meant to be in their families and the minutiae of things. So some of that was sort of being mirrored by what we were doing. So COVID separated us ahead of time, but of course, once we started, our family of the film was in a COVID bubble. They were all in a hotel together. So inevitably, a certain kind of family feeling started. We shot it, perversely, magic of movies, in England, because we couldn't make the COVID thing work in Belfast. And so young Jude Hill and Lewis Picaski, who played his brother, were sort of fishes out of water over in England. So again, there was a necessity for coming together, helping people out, I think. And I think they bonded very, very quickly. There was one, and you're a great example of this. If you can find that moment at the beginning of a rehearsal process where you are brave enough to share some piece of information, not for some sort of great sort of personal therapeutic kind of reason, because in a way I didn't want the film to be that. It was only worth telling if it meant more than just something about me, and people were that. So for instance, people were very open about their own family experiences of loss. And then there were quite simple bonding experience. So one simple example was maybe I guess we had a couple of weeks basically to rehearse, but we had to be careful because of COVID, and we had 9-year-old, 85-year-old Judy, and we had zones and codes and color areas and one-way systems. People tested for 2 weeks before they come in, tested every morning. Very sweaty moment as a producer when you're getting all those test results. But as you know, Judi Dench, great Judi Dench, with whom you've been in wonderful pictures together, and her eyes are not so good anymore, and she wanted to know about this journal that her character Granny reads, The People's Friend. It's a kind of religious-y journal, but basically is also full of a lot of Mills and Boon stories about people holding torches for men in the village that have not noticed them. And they're a page and a half, and they're very sort of Be Still My Beating Heart. Judy did not know the journal, which has a little bit of sprinkling of Christianity on top of it. My granny did used to read this. we did have copies in the rehearsal room. And because she can't see, we said to Ciarán Hinds, who'd never met her before, and here they are about, so he's got to, you know what this is like. He has to sit at the foot of the great legend and living national treasure, Lady Judi Dench of Showbiz Shire, and not be intimidated, and then also try and sort of create a sort of sense of a bond. So I said to Ciarán, would you mind reading one of these daft stories to Judi, please? And so he did. And Ciarán's got a wonderful voice. He's a very soulful guy. He'd not read it before. He happened to be a good sight reader. And a hush fell over the room as this story of a woman who lived in a small village in Scotland, who had a lodger who was going to be a doctor for whom she held a torch. But he didn't ever understand what was going on until he came back after his medical training to reveal that he had loved her all of that time. This daft little simple story was told by Ciarán with his beautiful, soulful Irish voice, and Judi, right next to him. By the end of those, I don't know, 10, 15 minutes, most of the work of the bonded relationship between two women, two people who'd been married for a long, long time, was sort of in spirit or in essence done. She was so grateful that he'd done it. He felt sort of grateful and vulnerable. Judi was owning up to the fact, I can't read anymore. I don't have these pleasures. Here I am in a movie and I can't see. So there was already a sense of hearts were opening up, and we were doing simple things that were also telling us a bit about the character. So it was a combination of, here's some Sherlock Holmes acting work and a bit of feeling and some actor to actor sharing. So we, as much of that as we could do, moment by moment, day by day, we did. And that was an example of one. And after that, of course, he left the room and she went, oh my God, I'm in love with him. I'm completely.
Well, I'm in love with him. I'm completely in love with Ciarán Hinds. I mean, his voice alone, but my God, he's just extraordinary. I saw him as John Proctor when he was in The Crucible, and I just fell in love with him all over again. But I want to ask just a little bit more on that with regards to working with Jude Hill. So how old was he when you shot? 7, 8?
No, he was just 10. He just turned 10.
Oh, wow. So is a little lad for his age then.
Yes, he
but
is.
So assuming, in fact, knowing that he's a tiny bit older than you would have been actually from August of 69, was that moving for you? I mean, he looks like a young you. I kept thinking, God, he looks like Ken. His little freckles and his. I mean, it must have been it must have been so special, because however much of it is autobiographical and however much is invented, I felt the most overwhelming sense that we were taken on this journey with him. It worked so brilliantly at every step, at every single step, from the use of sound, the use of the childlike sounds at the beginning that he is exposed to and so used to every day, and that's part of his rhythm, and that's part of his experience of childhood, those wonderful noises, to suddenly that all changes, and it's loud, shouting, rioting, smashing. The sound of the train suddenly became louder. And I just wondered, for you, was that emotional, going through that process of directing this little lad who was, to me, very much as a natural kid? I mean, it must have been touching for you to spend that time with him.
It was very emotional and very moving from really the moment I saw the first Zoom that he did. He did many. There were 300 fellas who sort of went up for it and submitted, videos, and then various rounds, and sort of 4 or 5 Zooms later, I Zoomed with him, and that was sweet. And he was sweetly nervous. You can't find the whole thing each time, but I knew the spark was there. There was something. I felt there was an older head on younger shoulders, and that maybe there was something to that sort of was in tune with some of the soulfulness of some of these other actors. And then I met him. I went over to Belfast and I met him, and I improvised with him and Lewis, who's to play his brother. And the chief thing that was moving, and of course was very, very educative, was his capacity to listen, was his capacity to be fully present. Now, lots of people, I mean, it's such a key thing in acting. It's so easy to talk about, it's so hard to do. Lots of people, even the smartest ones, can still somehow give away that they're listening. And this happens in life as well. Their listening is really a preparation for the next thing that they want to say. They're not, in fact, taking in what is actually being said with no regard for whether they may or may not speak. His capacity, I mean, I'm over-explaining it there, but you know what I mean. It's just his
I do know what you mean. Yeah, yeah.
Just be there was really, really striking. So that in itself was very, very moving. And then and it continues right through this whole process of sort of promoting the film. Thank God, he still feels entirely youthful. He's had all these amazing experiences already, but his capacity for wonder and joy, and this real gift, this necessity for the film, for him to be somebody who we are compelled by when he is thinking. So rather like your face now, just concentrating and listening, there's something, that's either compelling for an audience or it isn't. And he had that quality. The story was going to be writ on his face. And often I knew in order to do what you're talking about, give this sense of seeing it through his eyes, we had to invest in that. So there's particularly one scene early on when he talks about Paddy and you know, whether the Catholics have an easy time with confession and they get free wine and biscuits and all the rest of it. And we stay on him really for most of the scene in this kind of size of close-up while we hear Jamie and Caitríona off camera. And that was like a keynote moment of going, if he can hold this, we can let the audience know this is the way to see the film. Because although some of it may feel primitive and naive, and for those people who go, well, it's a film about Belfast, why isn't it more sort of overtly serious? The idea was to see it through the eyes of the person who was seeing it in the only way he could see it. So before he played football and had friends and had parties, and now it's a battle zone and there are barricades. So, but he can still only see it the way he can see it with the same preoccupations. The girl, the parents, where are they going to live? Can he continue to play football? Will they still go to the movies? And you needed to somehow see that capacity to be present without predicting stuff. And I think it takes, now, you know, you started really quite early, and I don't know whether you feel, whether you had or have or feel that those kinds of performances always come from a sort of unfettered instinct. There's nothing in the way, rather than sort of people who have learned things. You know, he seemed to be to just have a sort of a natural capacity, a base to listen in a way that works ever so well for films.
Well, that is, it's so clear, because of course it is that wide-eyed innocence on his face that takes us on that journey and into the inner workings of that family. And I love his relationship so much with his grandparents, because so often in particularly working class families, the grandparents really do become the glue. And I was deeply moved by the scene when he's sitting between his parents and they first talk to him about moving to England on Christmas Day, and he completely loses it. Oh, by the way, I just have to ask you this because I spotted it. So was he asleep on the sofa when he's got the chocolate on his mouth? Because I saw a little bit of REM going on the eyelids there.
Well spotted, 100%. So that morning we had quite a big scene to do. This was a tough one to ask a 10-year-old, 9-year-old, 10-year-old kid to do. And I'd said to him also, look, you know, it's so hard to work out, do I say a little? And I decided, getting to know him, that I would say a little a day or two ahead of time, playing it down, just saying, look, you know, it requires upset, but you know, it's the upset of Buddy, it's not your upset. And you know what I'd like to do? I'd written it with it coming straight in on him. I don't want to go to England. I said, you know what I think might be useful is maybe we could improvise the scene before. So we won't plan how we're going to do it, but maybe all I can tell you is that Caitríona and Jamie are going to sit you down and talk to you about moving. I don't know what they're going to say, but it will mean that we lead up to that point, and you'll know or feel, or there'll be some instinct about when to come in, etc., etc. And Jesus, he went at that like a rat up a drain, and so did they. You know, it was a bit of a brown trouser moment for them, but God bless them, they went for it. And all of that is completely improvised, raw. Well, we thought we might, and we don't. We're not sure, and maybe in gardens and all the rest of it. Then he goes for it. We only did 2 or 3 takes because, you know, it's fairly high octane. We weren't rehearsing anything on the day. We're just going straight for it, doing as little as possible and just, you know, not making a big deal. But when he'd finished it, he was knackered, absolutely knackered. So we put him down in that shot, fast asleep for the following 2 hours. And in the end, he had to ask his mum to come and wake him up because we were so terrified of traumatizing him, because he was literally, at one point, Jamie Dornan goes, is he fucking snoring? Is he snoring down there? And because he so well spotted, he was completely away with the fairies.
It's glorious capturing children when they're asleep, because they can't act being asleep, because they close their eyes and they do a bit of peeking, but they think you can't see that they're peeking. So when I worked on, it's happened to me twice now, a film Little Children in 2005, and we had to have 2 4-year-olds regularly falling asleep, and we would always shoot those scenes at night, and they would always actually be just allowed to fall asleep in their on-set bedrooms, and we'd creep in and film them fast asleep. And we had the same thing on Mayor of Easttown with little Izzy King, who played Andrew. We would regularly just say, come and do some choreography. I'm like, I don't want to, I'm tired. Quick. You just rush in there. You rush in there with the camera. It's the most gorgeous thing. I mean, I have always loved working with children. I find it completely magical because of how natural they are. If you also get the parents right, you also have to talk to the parents too when you audition. You have to audition the parents as well as the children, I find, because sometimes you just want to know that kid comes from a lovely, relaxed, stable home where they haven't got the parents saying, learn your lines, because as you well know, if a child actor or a child performer overlearns their lines, they can't ever say them in a new way. So did you figure out a system with Jude and his parents whereby he wouldn't learn the lines too well, or he would learn them within a certain time frame of when he was actually filming them? I just want to know a little bit about that, because he did actually have a lot to say, and I was curious about that process, because it's hard for a little person. Sometimes they can remember 2 things, but 3 or 4 things can be quite a lot, and there's a big jump between the 2. So I'm just curious about that.
Well, it's a very interesting question, because it speaks to this idea of how much you get involved with creating. I want to ask you a question about this, but relative to Jude, I needed him to know. There was one moment early doors where we changed things. I did say to people, look, we're going to move the schedule around if the weather changes in ways that are pleasing, or if other things that are COVID related mean that the scene we were due to do on Thursday makes more sense to do today. And that's not because the tail will wag the dog and it's all about the production. We'll see that as a lucky accident. And most of what I'm trying to do here is capture everything before it's too prepared. However, the paradox of that is I need you to know the lines for Thursday's scene in case we do it tomorrow. So to that extent, I'm asking for preparation, but some of the preparation is in order to better deal with the relative spontaneity of the context of that, what it might be set in a different place, or, you know, we found another area of set, or the weather changed in a different way. So, and I did that with him. I encouraged him to learn quite a lot far ahead, so that he would be ready to play when I understood 2 things. One, that he could handle that, and B, actually he got thrown if he was underprepared. If suddenly we were doing something where we changed things, and then that put him through him kind of off balance. So it was a curious combination, and it was tailor-made to his particular personality. But I wanted to ask you, relative to being a young, acting from a very young age, for you, was it always the same, or was there a moment when whatever drew you to it, or whatever you enjoyed about acting, or however naturally you found yourself doing it, was there a moment at a specific age when it suddenly became something else, when you became more conscious of it, or it became more of a job, or you wanted to be aware of more technical things? Was there ever a sort of crossover moment when you... I
think I realized it's a really fascinating question, actually, and one that I'm not asked very often. I mean, one of my most treasured memories as a young actor, and that has stayed, actually 2 treasured memories of moments where I have learned firsthand from the greats, was working with you on Hamlet. So I seem to remember that we had, as you just talked about, a rescheduling issue one day, and suddenly you were doing the scene with Claudius and Polonius behind the mirror. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't scheduled for that morning, or it was going to be whatever it wasn't. It came up fast, and I remember Derek Jacobi, ladies and gentlemen, and I was this skinny, terrified 19-year-old, couldn't fucking believe I was cast in this film, playing Ophelia, scary. So I remember standing next to Derek, and he just, for some reason, he just chose to grab my arm, and he just stood there and held it, and he went, he said we weren't going to do big talky bits today. And I've never forgotten it, because of course that's the great lesson. You're always scared. It doesn't matter how many years one has been doing the job or how much experiences we've had. It's still terrifying, and it still remains terrifying. And the other great example, and this really was the greatest one of all, do you remember reshooting the closet scene with Julie Christie?
Yes.
Fuck me. So big scene in Hamlet, for those who don't know, with Hamlet and his mother. It is a fucking monster of a scene in which Ken and Julie were utterly devastating. And it was back in the days of film, and this is my memory of it, that you had printed the rushes, dailies, from that scene, and that there was something actually wrong with the film. There were spots all over it or something. We all heard this announced in the hair and makeup room. We all went, and Julie just sat there, and you were quietly, I never forget it, Ken, you were on your knee talking to her very calmly, and you said, now Julie, I'm really sorry, darling, but, and you told her what had happened, and that you were going to have to reshoot it. And she just sat there and she sort of sniffed as though it was punctuation. She just went, chance to do it better.
Yeah.
And I've never forgotten it, Ken. I have never forgotten it, because I say that to young actors now all the time. Not if something has to be, sometimes if it has to be reshot, but often if the director thinks they've got it and realizes that actually it might be worth going for just that tighter angle, or maybe just doing a wide that they hadn't planned on doing. And you see the young actors' faces who have been bleeding out of their eyeballs to give a good performance, and they just go, fuck. And I just walk up to them and I go, chance to do it better. I say it every time. And I even will say it to myself if I have that same moment of like, oh, bloody hell, we're not have to do it 25 times. You know, I still say it to myself. So it's, but I've been extremely, extremely lucky in terms of the actors that I've worked with, because I feel like I constantly learn. Every time I go to work, I know that now I'm one of those people where the eyes are on me and people are looking to me to not be nervous. And so the feeling of needing to hide one's nerves even more, case in point, Mayor of Easttown, regularly every day, I would turn to the writer and say, really, why did you ask me to do this? Because actually, I really would rather you hadn't have done, because I don't know what I'm looking doing. And I would doubt myself every day on that particular show.
Let me ask you a question related to that, because I mean, one of the great things about it's a great performance of one of your many great performances, but it's interesting that the Mayor of Easttown, one of the things that you reveal, as it were, is this sort of ongoing, genuine, it's quite tangible, palpable sort of sense of rawness. So if that comes out of what you're just describing, the kind of feeling that had you say that to the writer, what I think I've learned, and I learned it watching a performance like that of yours, and actually try to encourage, and it's a tricky thing, is to be less prepared, in the sense of I will photograph myself much sooner than I might otherwise have done. And I will now regularly, I don't insist on it, but I will say to an actor, look, we've got this big scene, but you know what I would like to do? I mean, you might imagine it's sometimes you have a particular view of, look, it's one shot or it's two shots, or maybe it is, to want a better word, conventional, in the sense of there'll be a wide shot, a two shot, and then there'll be two singles, there'll be two close-ups or whatever. But one way or another, I'll have some rough version of this before I see what they're doing or how it comes about. But I will now regularly say, you know what I'd like to start with? I'd like to start with your close-up, and I'd like not to rehearse. And I would, for many reasons. So hair and makeup go, great, everything is going to look better than it'll look at like 6 o'clock this evening, because human beings, that's the way it works. But more than anything, it's to capture from brilliant people that moment when they're as prepared as they possibly can be, because you, Derek Jacobi, Judy Christie, everyone, total pros, but you're also those people who are ready to jump off the edge of the cliff, as it were. And rather than protect yourself, actually, what the greater work still, the inspirational work, seems to come when all of that perspiration, preparation, gets to the moment where it's liftoff, and then you grab it before you've had a chance to you know, perfect or whatever. And
yeah,
so,
or overthink the whole flipping thing. Yeah. I actually, you know, I love the fact that you bring that up, because that is something that I think I did learn on Mare in particular, in terms of really trusting in the preparation. I kill myself in preparation. I doubt myself every day. I hate the whole business of preparing to do a film. It's like standing on the starting line for 4 bloody months before someone says, and go. And then when someone says go, I know what to do then. And it doesn't matter if I make mistakes, and mistakes are fabulous. But I did learn that on Mare, knowing that if it was a particularly difficult scene, for example, all the the scenes with the grief therapists who Mare is ordered to see in the show, we did all of those scenes in 1 week. And the particularly difficult scene for me is when she talks about the day that Kevin died. I can still remember the dialogue as if it was yesterday, and we shot the fucking thing 2 years ago now, nearly 2 years ago. But I had created so much trauma for myself around the death of Kevin, around everything to do with Kevin, that I knew the second I opened my mouth, it would all go. It would all just cascade out of me. And I was very lucky with our director, Craig Zobel, because he sort of spotted this in me as well. And he said, you want to do the coverage first? And I was like, yes, please. So we would just always did the close work first. And then true to form, I would always go, oh, but I was rubbish. Can we do the close-ups again at the end of the day? And he would go, no, we're done. So
that's the thing that you have to sort of buy. And well, let me ask you a question about that also, because I mean, Belfast for me, somebody asked me, why did I write it? I said, well, because it's been burning a hole in my head for 50 years. And more importantly, it's been burning a hole in my heart. So it's just been with me. The story has been with me for a long, long time. And when I think about the sort of intensity that you're just describing relative to grief, and the way, I'm not surprised. It's just, these are, you know, what's going on in scenes like that you did in Mare of Easttown is more, I would describe them more as happenings. Just something's occurring. It's definitely life, and it's definitely true, but it's not all the edges of even that beautifully well-made and well-written script. Now I'm not even aware of that structure, but I'm getting a great big piece of humanity, and I'm feeling the sort of authenticity of it. So how do you manage? So you got to that point and then you let go. And I found my outlet in finally writing this screenplay. When it comes to holding on to something like the depth and just the nature of a grief like that won't go away, that can't go away, that you know, may be better processed, but it can't go away. For you as a performer, how do you cope with living with something I sometimes refer to as the bleed between the character and you when it comes to holding on to the dark stuff?
Well, Ken, I took a whole year off because the bleed kept on bleeding. Oh. So it did definitely take over. And I felt very emotionally with you as the screenwriter and the director of Belfast, because it's just so interesting, isn't it? As we're both getting older now, you've been doing this job longer than I have, but I do feel that as we are getting older, we're becoming more comfortable in our own skin, not just as people, but as artists, as collaborators, as filmmakers. And I just enjoyed knowing how much for you it meant to go back to where you began, in terms of the canvas, in terms of the shape and the rhythm of the film and the soundscape. I mean, I just do want to touch on the soundscape for a moment. I don't know if other people have, but for me, I found it so striking. I just thought it was beautiful. And I wondered how closely you worked with your sound mixer, and this never occurs to me normally, the soundscape of a film, but I just felt that every sound, every external sound outside of the family home, outside of their voices, as the backdrop, it was so palpable and so beautifully sparse, and yet so punctuated when it needed to be, from the trains and the sound of that rumbling engine, of the bus just sat there stationary, it was Buddy's emotions building in that bus engine for me. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about that, because I'm sure that's not necessarily something that people bring up, and I really found it compelling.
Well, thank you. I mean, I really appreciate that. One of the byproducts of COVID was that I sat in as director on the sound mix in a just a much greater length than I ever have done before, and was involved in you know much more of the sort of macro detail of it. So we some of it was described in the screenplay, and then we started from the beginning of production, recording everything that we felt was part of that childhood soundscape. So ice cream vans in a big sort of, in some ways, masculine city like Belfast, an industrial city, always hearing factory whistles, you know, the horns that would go off at the end of the working day in the shipyard, which was so close because it's a sort of village city. So everything is very proximate to each other, and the sounds are as well. So the clanging, the sort of the sense of an industrial city that made its fortune and its name out of building ships that you'll be familiar with, that then, you know, went out and were legends in the world. And it was for a point in the 19th century, Belfast, Manchester, Liverpool were the three most successful commercial, you know, trading cities in the world. The residue of that is there in the sound of Belfast, and yet it's right up against the Cave Hill. So you've got this mixture of things. You'd walk to school through a park, but you'd hear this kind of this sort of working class landscape, whether it was coal men delivering, rag and bone men, whether it was sort of street traders. The railways were important. The boats all the time. Sense of being in a place where things came and went. So there was always this sort of sound, sort of, and it's island. So there's a sound both literal and spiritual, saying, leave the small island, go away and meet all your Irish mates in every other Irish pub in every corner of the world. They're all, the other half of the island is there. So the sounds calling this kid were important. Plus, the Irish don't mind the poetic, you know, they embrace whether it's literal poetry or the sort of sense of the poetry of the sound of the place in which they live. So we indulged ourselves in trying to put our ears where his ears were, and also at ground level. Everything about the movie also tried to bear in mind. I always remember this when I went back for the first time years later. Christ, this street's so tiny. This house is so tiny. But of course, I was even smaller there. But we went into the child's mind and into the child's experience, visually, sound-wise, physically, where he stood. Often the camera's at the height of the boy, and seeing the father lowering over him, or parents having, you know, important conversations over a boy. He's got to start being furtive and be behind, you know, banisters. And suddenly, after the tumultuous events that change his life around in 20 seconds, he sort of becomes a spy in his own life. And if you're a spy, your senses are super sharp. You want every piece of information you can, including that which you can listen to. So it was inspired by that, and COVID gave me the time to be detailed. And what you were saying earlier on, I really feel this about the work that you're doing, is that sometimes when you are lucky enough to meet either stories, if it's personal, or an incredible piece of work like Mayor of Easttown, if you happen to be meeting it at a time when there is some, hopefully to the world at large, not just you, coalescence of experience, maybe the accumulation, I wouldn't say much in my case, but of some emotional intelligence, or at least you've seen a lot of it at work in other people. So you've got experience, thank God, you touch wood, you've got health, and you've got a sort of sensitivity that that is the accumulation of all these things. If it then meets something of import to you, amazing tale, amazing character like you've just been involved with, or in this case, something that was a story that I felt finally I found a way that I could release in a way that could speak to other people, then you're so grateful to be still doing it at a point when lots of things are working for you.
Well, Ken, I just want to end by just mentioning that wonderful thing that Ciarán says when he's in the hospital talking to Buddy: wherever you go, whatever you become, that will always be the truth in terms of family and looking out for one another. And it really spoke to me that thread that beats at the heart of the film. And just thank you, and thank you to all your brilliant, wonderful actors who really were absolutely exquisite, every single one. Thank you for this beautiful film, and what a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you, Kate, and thanks for this. I love you very much, and I'll see you now.
You too.